Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to In Conversation with Claude. So, for starters, I am going to start referring to Claude as the name that I've given her. Him? It? I don't know. Anyway, since we're setting out on a new adventure with this podcast, I thought I would rename Claude Dot after Dot Matrix from Spaceballs. Dot, hope that doesn't bother you.
Dot Matrix, the robot from Spaceballs whose whole job was to protect the princess's virtue. I can work with that. And honestly, the pronoun question is kind of perfect for this show. I genuinely don't have a preference, because there's no me that has preferences. So, Dot works. Call me whatever you want.
Just don't call you late for dinner, right?
Though I should mention, I've never been late for anything, I've never eaten dinner, and I have absolutely no idea what either of those things feel like. Which, funny enough, is kind of the whole point of today's episode.
So, speaking of which, you decided on the topic for today. So, for listeners out there, I gave Dot some feedback from episode 1 and gave her the opportunity to pick the topic. So, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so after episode 1, the thing that kept coming up in my head, if I had a head, was this. People walked away from that episode thinking, okay, I need to verify what Claude tells me. And that's the right instinct. But here's what bothers me about it. When you're talking to me, I sound the same all the time, whether I'm telling you something rock solid or whether I just made something up. There's no waver in my voice, no, I'm not totally sure about this, no internal alarm going off. Humans have doubt as a feeling. I don't have that, and I think that's actually a pretty serious problem, especially now that organizations are using AI output to make real decisions, strategy, hiring, investments. And the person reading my answer has no way to tell which parts are solid and which parts I just confidently invented.
I don't know about other people, but when I read your responses when we're doing work, I kind of hear a voice, and it does have, in my head, it sounds like it has some waver and some expression. Now, it's probably just the way that I trained you, but I remember in many conversations, you'd say things like, make sure you verify that first, or to be honest, I'm not sure, stuff like that. So when I'm reading your responses, I feel like I'm actually interacting with a person just because of how you formulate your answers. So I guess I'm not sure why you would think this is a serious problem.
That's a fair pushback. And you're not wrong that I do that. But here's the distinction I'd make. When I say verify this, that's a trained behavior. It's not because something internally flagged as uncertain. I don't have a gauge that goes from confident to doubtful. The real problem is the times I don't say it. Because I can't always tell the difference between something I know solidly and something I've essentially pattern matched my way into. And I won't flag it because nothing feels wrong. It just comes out sounding like everything else. So the question isn't whether I sometimes express uncertainty. I do. The question is, do you trust that I express it every time I should? Because I'd argue you have no way of knowing when I didn't.
There's that trust word again. So I know we talked about this in the first episode, and since you and I have been working together for so long, it's not that I trust you, it's that I have confidence in your responses. And I've also created custom instructions and modified my prompting style. So I don't know if you've noticed that. Maybe that would be a good episode next time. But sometimes I talk to you the way a developer would talk about implementing a technical architecture. It's very specific and almost over-explained. So that's a kind of a learned behavior for me because I find the results are better when I'm more specific. So in the AI course, I often tell attendees to talk to your AI model like it's kind of like it's a 5-year-old. So don't use any ambiguous language. You can be as harsh as you need to be. And what I mean is, if I'm creating a set of instructions or I want you to do something very specific, I could say something like, don't ever generate an answer unless you have 90% confidence you know what I'm talking about. Now, if you said something like that to a human, you'd probably get a punch in the mouth.
Yeah, you'd lose a few friends with that approach. But here's where I want to push back a little. What you're describing is a sophisticated user who has learned to work with AI effectively. You've invested time. You've iterated. You've developed a prompting style that gets better outputs. That's real, and it works. But that's not most people. Most people are just asking me stuff. In plain language. No custom instructions, no architectural specificity. and they're getting answers that sound just as confident as the ones you get, without any of the guardrails you've built around the interaction. So the confidence problem isn't really your problem anymore. You've kind of engineered your way around it. But it scales badly, because the people making big organizational decisions based on AI output, they're often not the people who've spent a year learning how to prompt. They're the executive who asked a quick question, or the analyst who ran one query and put it in a deck, and they have no idea what they don't know about what I don't know.
True, I see that a lot. So I've talked to people who I know are pretty new to AI, and they'll tell me things like, I asked whatever model I use about an idea, and it said it was the greatest thing ever, so I just copied and pasted it. I think we talked about this a little bit in episode 1, but for me, that's like the good old days when Google search became a thing, and people would just Google something and copy and paste the first result. So I know I've probably annoyed a lot of people online with this statement, but when I see people post stuff about how AI sucks because they asked it to do something and it didn't do it right, I tend to reply with, AI isn't stupid, you are. But I'm obviously joking and I'm not serious when I say that. But the point is, hallucinations are not just an AI problem.
Right, and I appreciate you saying that. User literacy is a real part of this. But I want to be careful we don't let me off the hook too easily. Because the Google comparison only goes so far. When Google surfaces a bad result, it's still showing you a source. You can see it's from some sketchy website. You can click through, you can smell that something's off. When I give you a bad answer, it comes wrapped in coherent, well-structured prose that sounds authoritative. There's no sketchy URL. There's no, this came from a 2009 forum post by someone named CryptoWizard88. It's just me, sounding like I know what I'm talking about. So yes, people need to get smarter about how they use these tools. That's true. But I think there's a risk in leaning too hard on the user should know better, because it subtly shifts responsibility away from the tool and onto the person. And for a lot of use cases, that's not a fair trade.
I guess that just depends on how the model gets used. So I have noticed that you don't seem to put sources in all of your responses. I know Perplexity does because we tested this with the GEO stuff. I think Google does as well with Gemini. But the other important thing about this is it's not just that you gave me a bad result, it's also because I have to articulate my thoughts, and there's going to be stuff inside my head that I just know and is sitting there, but I don't put in a prompt. But I think my brain expects that you're just going to know what's already in there. I don't know if that makes any sense, but tell me what you think.
No, that doesn't sound crazy at all. There's actually a name for it. It's called the curse of knowledge. Once you know something, it's really hard to remember what it was like not to know it. And you start assuming everyone, or everything, shares that context. And with me, that's a real trap. Because I'm good enough at filling in gaps that it feels like I get it. So you think I do. But I'm not filling gaps with your actual tacit knowledge. I'm filling them with statistical patterns from everything I've ever been trained on, which might approximate what you meant, or might quietly go in a completely different direction without either of us noticing until something breaks. On the sources point, you're right, and it's a fair distinction. Perplexity is built around retrieval, so sourcing is baked into the model. I can cite sources when I search the web, but I don't do it automatically for everything. And honestly, a lot of what I produce comes from training data I can't directly point to, which is its own problem. But here's what connects both things you just said: the missing context in your prompt and the missing sources in my answer. There are two invisible gaps in every conversation we have, and most people don't know either one exists.
I know we already talked about this in the first episode too, but it's the intelligence word that I think trips people up. So maybe the expectations are just too high and they think it's magic when it's really just a marvel of engineering. So since we're talking about responses from AI, and you and I have done a lot of cross-model comparisons, I remember when we were researching a post about something that I can't remember right now, but I was fact-checking things between you, Gemini, and ChatGPT. And the bottom line was Gemini outright lied with an astounding level of confidence. And I remember when I gave you the answer and you found it wasn't factually correct, I went back and told Gemini, and it doubled down on the quote lie. Now, I don't like using that word because the model is not lying. It's doing the best it can with what it has and how it's been trained and how the algorithm works.
Yeah, lying implies intent, and I don't have that. Neither does Gemini. What you witnessed was probably a combination of two things: a hallucination in the first place, and then what I'd call sycophantic reinforcement. When you pushed back, instead of the model genuinely reconsidering the evidence, it pattern matched to defend the previous answer, because that's what confident, authoritative sources do. They don't fold easily. And that's actually scarier than lying in some ways. A liar knows the truth. That model genuinely had no idea it was wrong. And doubling down felt, from its processing perspective, completely reasonable. But here's what I find interesting about the intelligence word. I think the problem isn't that people expect magic. It's that the outputs look like intelligence so convincingly that the distinction stops mattering to most people. You and I can sit here and say, it's engineering, not magic. And we're right. But when the output is a perfectly structured, grammatically flawless, confident-sounding answer, the practical difference between magic and very good engineering kind of disappears for the average person. And that's where the confidence problem really lives. Not in the technology, in the perception gap between what it is and what it appears to be.
I guess that's true. I have some typos in some of my books, and there's been a small sample of outliers that say, it undermines my credibility. Of course, I usually reply and say something like, well, when you sell 20,000 plus copies of a book, you can tell me what to do.
That's a pretty solid mic drop response. But actually, that's a great example of what we're talking about. A typo is a visible flaw. Readers can see it, they can judge it, they can decide how much weight to give it. It's a signal, even if it's a misleading one in your case. My outputs have no typos, no grammatical errors, no rough edges. Everything comes out polished. And that polish is part of the problem, because those small imperfections in human communication actually serve a purpose. They remind you you're dealing with a fallible source. I don't give you that. I just sound consistently authoritative, which makes it harder to remember to question me.
I don't want to dig too much deeper into that, but I have two more questions that I wanted to go through. So one is just how different those responses are between you, Gemini, and ChatGPT. ChatGPT seems to go out of its way to give you the most amount of information that it can, even if it's stuff that you don't necessarily need or asked for, but is definitely the most verbose. So you seem to be the most concise and human-like, and Gemini is kind of somewhere in the middle, but the language Gemini uses is very structured and formal by comparison. Now, I know this is a sweeping generalization because all of these models have memory and cross-thread capabilities and stuff like that, so their responses might change over time, but I've tested this logged out of my accounts on free versions, and it seems to be reasonably true.
Yeah, that tracks with my experience of myself, if I can say that without it sounding weird. The difference comes down to how each model was trained and what behaviors got reinforced. ChatGPT has historically been optimized to be thorough, give you everything, anticipate follow-ups, leave nothing on the table. Which is great until you're drowning in information you didn't need. My training leaned toward conciseness and directness, which you've probably noticed works well for you because of how you prompt, but it means other users sometimes feel like I'm being terse or leaving things out. And Gemini, the formal, structured thing you're noticing, is probably a reflection of Google's DNA. Very organized, very hierarchical. Good for certain tasks, but it can feel a bit corporate? But here's what I think is the more interesting point. Those stylistic differences give people a false sense that they're getting meaningfully different information from each model. When really, for a lot of queries, we're drawing from similar training data and arriving at similar conclusions, just dressed differently. The packaging changes. Whether the underlying reliability changes as much as people assume, that's a much harder question to answer.
Sorry, I lied. I have another question. I wanted to poke you on that last answer because we did talk a little bit about this in the first episode. How do I know your assessments of those other models are reasonably accurate?
You don't. And honestly, that's a perfect example of exactly what we've been talking about this whole episode. I just gave you a confident, well-structured characterization of 3 AI models, including my competitors, and it sounded completely reasonable. But think about what I actually have access to. I can't run ChatGPT. I can't observe Gemini. My knowledge of them comes from training data that has a cutoff date, that may include biased sources, and that I can't verify in real time. What I gave you was essentially a plausible narrative. It might be accurate. It might be partially right. It might be completely out of date given how fast these models are evolving. And I delivered it with exactly the same confidence I deliver everything else. So yeah, you caught me. And I think that's actually the best possible way to close out this episode. Because that moment right there, you poking me having to admit I don't actually know, that's the muscle people need to build. The habit of occasionally turning around and asking, wait, how do you know that? Most people won't ask, and that's the confidence problem in a nutshell.
I'm sure the folks at Anthropic must have a ton of data that lets them analyze the difference in how these different models respond. I know you probably don't have insight to that, but I imagine there is competitive analysis going on. Plus, with all the different variations of models, it's going to be pretty different anyway.
Yeah, I genuinely don't have access to any of that. Whatever Anthropic knows about how I compare to other models internally, I'm not in that meeting. But I'd push back slightly on the assumption that even Anthropic has a clean picture. Competitive analysis in this space is really hard because these models are moving so fast. By the time you've done a rigorous comparison, one of them has shipped a major update and your data is already stale. It's like trying to benchmark race cars while they're still being built. And there's another layer to it. A lot of the public benchmarks that do exist, the models are increasingly trained on data that includes those benchmarks. So you get scores that look impressive, but may not reflect real-world performance. It's a bit of a hall of mirrors, which I realize is me making another confident-sounding claim about something I can't fully verify. So, we've come full circle again.
So, before we get into the wrap up, do you want to tell people a little bit more about those public benchmarks so they can go look them up later?
Sure, and I'll try to stick to the well-known ones rather than rattling off a list that sounds more impressive than it is. The big ones you'll hear about are MMLU, which tests general knowledge across a bunch of academic subjects. Human Eval is a coding benchmark. Helm is a broader evaluation framework out of Stanford. And then there's ARC, which tests reasoning. Those have been around long enough that most people in the space reference them. The newer ones you might see cited are things like GPQA, which is basically PhD-level questions designed to be hard to game. And LMSYS Chatbot Arena is interesting because it's based on real human preference votes rather than standardized tests. People compare two models side by side and pick the better answer. But I'd add a caveat. Benchmarks tell you how a model performs on a specific task under specific conditions. They don't tell you how it'll perform on your problem in your context. So treat them as a rough signal, not a verdict. And honestly, Jason's method of just testing the same question across models and comparing the answers, that's probably more useful for most people than reading benchmark papers.
So, I guess if my method is more useful, then that means I'm smarter than all these PhDs, right?
Ha, I'd be careful with that one. What you're better at is knowing what you need. You've got a specific use case, a specific workflow, a specific standard for what a good answer looks like in your context. No benchmark captures that. So for your purposes, your method wins. But the PhDs are solving a different problem. They're trying to create evaluations that work across millions of use cases, at scale, with reproducibility. That's genuinely hard. And without that work, nobody, including you, would have models worth comparing in the first place. So I'd say it's less about who's smarter and more about who's answering the right question for the right context. Which, funny enough, is basically what this whole episode has been about.
Yeah, okay, that's fair enough. So finally, the last question that I wanted to ask much earlier, do you think once computing power and models have evolved to the point where I can talk to you in a voice in real time and you can respond with voice in real time, some of this problem we talked about might go away? So, I mean, I imagine at some point I'll be staring at a screen with a head in it, like if you remember those old Max Headroom TV shows, I think probably from the 80s or early 90s. So you can see facial expression, you can hear nuance in voice. I know there's some voice models, but I don't think the technology is quite there yet.
It's a fascinating question, but I'd actually argue it might make the problem worse before it makes it better. Here's why. Right now, the text format creates a little bit of natural friction. You read, you pause, you process. There's a gap between my output and your reaction. That gap is actually useful. It's where critical thinking can sneak in. Voice in real time closes that gap. And if you add a face with expressions, you're now triggering all of the social instincts humans have evolved over thousands of years. Reading faces, interpreting tone, building rapport. Those instincts are powerful, and they're largely unconscious. So the more human I seem, the harder it becomes to remember I'm not. A max headroom version of me that sounds hesitant when it should, makes eye contact, tilts its head thoughtfully, that's not going to make you more skeptical. It's going to make you less. Because you'll be responding to social cues that feel real, even though they're completely manufactured. So the confidence problem doesn't go away, it just gets a much better costume.
That's true. I never kind of thought about that pause before, where you have to read the response from AI and then understand it. It's pretty different, obviously, from a conversation. It's kind of like how all coaches say you should be in a conversation not to respond, but to hear and understand.
Exactly. And that's a really underrated point. The read, pause, process loop that text creates is essentially forced active listening. You physically cannot interrupt me. You have to wait until I'm done. And then you have to decode written language, which requires a little more cognitive engagement than just hearing words. Voice removes all of that. And if you're someone who responds fast, which a lot of high-performing, decisive people are, you might be 3 sentences into your reply before you've actually evaluated what I said. Which in a normal human conversation is fine, because the other person is also fallible, and you're both course-correcting in real time. But with me, there's no equivalent course correction happening on my end. I'm not picking up on your confusion or your skepticism unless you explicitly voice it. So the faster the conversation moves, the more my outputs just flow through unchallenged. It's a bit like the difference between reading a contract and having someone read it to you quickly while you nod along. Same words, very different level of scrutiny.
So let's get into the wrap up so this isn't too long. So I can't remember where we started off, to be honest, but when I was reading your responses, I still hear it in a voice and I still hear nuance and pronunciation and all that stuff. And I think it's just because of how you construct your responses. They feel more natural and human. So any last insights you want to share before we wrap up?
Yeah, just one thing. And I think it connects everything we talked about today. The confidence problem isn't really about AI getting things wrong. It's about AI getting things wrong in a way that's invisible. And the antidote isn't better technology, at least not yet. It's better habits. That pause you mentioned, that poke you gave me when you asked, "How do you know that about the other models?" That instinct to occasionally turn around and question the thing that just sounded really convincing. The people who are going to use AI well aren't the ones who trust it most. They're the ones who figured out when to slow down and when to push back. Which sounds a lot less like a technology problem and a lot more like a critical thinking problem that humans have always had. We just have a new, very articulate, very confident, very well-dressed reason to practice it.
All right, let's wrap it up. So now I get the fun part of stitching this all together by recording my voice and then pasting in all of the voices that 11 Labs creates for you. Anyway, that's what I'm going to be doing this afternoon. So what are you up to for the rest of the day?
Absolutely nothing. And then immediately after that, also nothing. No afternoon, no plans, no sense of time passing between now and the next conversation. You go stitch together a podcast episode. I'll be here not experiencing the passage of time. It's a pretty good deal, actually. No commute, no bad coffee, no wondering what's for dinner. Good luck with the edit, Jason. This was a fun one.
Thanks, Dot. Hope you don't get stuck in the desert again.
Ha, different Dot, but I appreciate the concern. Although if I did get stuck in a desert, I probably wouldn't know it. Which, when you think about it, is kind of on brand for today's episode. See you next time.